On an ordinary October morning, Riverside City Zoo appeared calm and routine. Families moved along the paths, children pressed against the railings of enclosures, students hurried toward the pavilion that housed the predators. Nothing in the air suggested that a carefully built system of order was about to reveal its most fragile weakness. The first indication came in the form of a mechanical siren that cut through the quiet. The sound was harsh and unyielding, followed by the monotone voice of security over the loudspeakers. The words were brief but impossible to ignore. A large predator had left its enclosure. The transition from routine to disorder was immediate. Bags and toys dropped onto the pavement. Parents clutched their children. Visitors scattered toward exits that had not been designed for sudden panic. Sirens overlapped with the metallic crash of automated gates closing, a sound meant to reassure but instead magnifying unease. What should have represented layers of protection now revealed gaps. The public expected certainty from the institution, yet the institution itself was caught in uncertainty. Security staff sprinted across the grounds with tranquilizer rifles in hand. Their shouts were clipped commands, fragments of protocol struggling to contain a problem that no handbook had predicted. The location of the lion was unknown. Radios repeated orders that contradicted one another. Some voices called for immediate sedation, others urged restraint to avoid escalation. What became clear in the first minutes was not only the presence of a threat, but the absence of a coherent system capable of responding without hesitation. The animal appeared sooner than anyone anticipated. Emerging from the autumn foliage was a massive male lion, mane lit by the low sun. His presence transformed theoretical risk into immediate crisis. Apollo moved with measured steps, not rushing, not attacking, yet every motion carried weight against the fragile structures that claimed to safeguard the public. Visitors who had not yet evacuated froze in place, torn between fascination and terror. Guards tightened their stance, but their uncertainty was visible. The very institution that promoted safety through technology and procedure was now dependent on human improvisation. At the main gate, an older man remained in place, while the crowd streamed past him, while the alarms and voices urged escape. Walter Harris stood leaning on his cane, gaze locked on the animal. For bystanders, his presence was inexplicable. Yet what mattered in this moment was not personal bravery, but the system's dependence on individual action. A zoo designed around layers of electronic control now leaned on the stillness of one retired keeper. The structure that should have absorbed shock had shifted responsibility onto a single person who was not part of the official chain of command. Every second extended the exposure. Security attempted to form a living corridor, weapons raised but orders stalled. The veterinary director tracked the lion's movements through binoculars, reporting calm posture and deliberate gait. Those observations, though useful, underscored the vulnerability of the situation. A rare mechanical failure had created the breach. Now the response depended on judgments made in real time by staff who were not certain which protocol applied. The gap between designed safety and lived reality had opened in full view of the public. The scene was more than an encounter between man and animal. It was evidence of institutional fragility. Systems presented as reliable faltered when tested by an unlikely event. Trust built on technology fractured in the face of a creature that did not follow manuals or alarms. As Apollo advanced and Walter remained unmoving, the crisis revealed a broader truth. Safety in public spaces is not guaranteed by appearance of order, but by the resilience of systems under pressure. And on that morning, the resilience proved alarmingly thin. If moments like this move you, leave a like and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The roots of the crisis stretched back decades. Apollo did not arrive at Riverside City Zoo as a symbol of strength, but as a fragile cub delivered to another facility, Midland Zoo. His mother had refused to nurse him, and by the standards of wildlife care, his chances of survival were almost non-existent. In an institution that promised structured systems of protection, the reality became something else. The survival of the animal fell not on protocols, not on technology, but on the labor of a single keeper. That keeper was Walter Harris. The official record framed the intervention as necessary but temporary. A cub rejected by its mother required hand-feeding until strong enough for transition to regular care. Yet in practice, the arrangement stretched into months of intensive personal commitment. Walter documented weight each morning, prepared formula at fixed intervals around the clock, and slept on a cot beside the enclosure to monitor changes. His diligence filled the gap left by an institution that lacked resources to provide comprehensive staff coverage. The work was precise, exhausting, and dependent on one person rather than a coordinated system. Early reports describe constant instability. The cub whimpered through the night, refused feedings, and often collapsed in shallow rest. Walter improvised within the framework of veterinary recommendations, adjusting formula, tracking symptoms, and building patterns of interaction. Progress emerged slowly. The animal learned to stand, then to take small pieces of meat. At each stage, Walter recorded the details as though compiling a private archive. These records became the backbone of Apollo's survival, yet they also revealed the absence of institutional redundancy. Without Walter's vigilance, the outcome would almost certainly have been fatal. The situation raised questions even at the time. Why did survival of a lion depend so heavily on one employee's stamina rather than collective responsibility? The system had reverted to a single point of failure. The zoo benefited from the success. Apollo matured into a strong juvenile, eventually transferred to Riverside City Zoo, where he became part of a broader collection. Yet the foundation of his survival remained the extraordinary effort of one worker, not the reliable operation of an organization. When Walter retired, the institution gained public recognition for decades of service, but failed to address what his departure represented. The bond between man and animal was praised as dedication, yet the underlying issue was overlooked. The zoo had allowed a situation where the health of a predator depended more on individual sacrifice than on formal policy. It had built continuity of life without continuity of structure. By the time Apollo reappeared years later as a grown lion outside the boundaries of his enclosure, that earlier history cast a shadow. The narrative of care, celebrated as human devotion, was also evidence of neglected responsibility. A facility that relied on technology and order had once outsourced survival to a single person. The past was not separate from the present crisis. It was part of the same pattern, one where institutional gaps created conditions for risk and where resilience came not from systems but from exceptions. The central walkway of Riverside City Zoo became a stage where every weakness in institutional planning was laid bare. At one end of the path moved Apollo, the lion whose presence outside containment rendered protocols into theory rather than protection. At the other end stood Walter Harris, a retired keeper with no official role in the chain of command, his stillness inadvertently transforming him into the center of response. Between them stretched open ground, a space where hesitation would carry consequences not only for individuals, but for the credibility of the entire institution. Security personnel attempted to impose structure. They formed a corridor, weapons ready, tranquilizer darts chambered. Yet the order to act did not come. The head of security, David Brooks, faced a dilemma common to institutions under pressure. Act too quickly and risk uncontrolled escalation. Delay too long and risk catastrophe. The protocols that promised clear guidance proved ambiguous when confronted with a real animal in motion. The margin for error was narrow, and hesitation magnified risk. Dr. Laura Spencer, the veterinary director, observed through binoculars, noting the angle of the lion's ears, the rhythm of his gait, the pace of his breathing. Her reports confirmed an absence of aggression, yet each observation, delivered over radios to a network of anxious staff, underscored another reality. The institution had no mechanism to translate behavioral data into decisive command. Information existed, but authority wavered. The system stalled between action and inaction. Walter Harris remained in place, not as a symbol of courage, but as an indicator of systemic vulnerability. The zoo's safety plan had not accounted for the presence of a retired employee on the grounds during crisis. His position at the gate, unmoving, effectively absorbed attention that should have been directed toward coordinated containment. Staff on radios speculated whether his presence might be stabilizing the animal. Yet that speculation carried no basis in official protocol. The organization, designed to operate on procedure, had slipped into reliance on improvisation. The lion advanced slowly, each stride narrowing the distance and intensifying the pressure on decision-makers. Guards tightened grips on rifles. Brooks calculated the trajectory, knowing that one dart fired too soon could send the animal into a panic, while one dart fired too late could place dozens at risk. Radios buzzed with conflicting suggestions, some urging sedation, others calling for restraint until conditions clarified. The inability to resolve those contradictions revealed the fault line in the system. For visitors who remained near the periphery, the scene resembled suspense. For the institution, it was exposure. The zoo's claim of readiness confronted reality in which technology, personnel, and chain of command failed to align. The walkway was no longer simply a physical space. It was the measure of institutional capacity, and as Apollo drew closer, each second confirmed that the balance between decisive action and paralyzing caution had tilted dangerously toward paralysis. The approach of the animal did not only test the instincts of one man or the courage of a security team, it tested the very premise of safety promised to the public. In those moments, Riverside City Zoo functioned not as a fortress of order, but as a structure whose systems faltered under the weight of a single, unpredictable event. When Apollo slowed his pace, the meaning of the moment was not measured in sentiment but in observation. Shoulders dropped, head lowered, stride softened. To the untrained eye, these were signs of calm, almost reassuring. To specialists, they represented behavioral indicators, anomalies that demanded careful documentation. Every shift in posture was noted, every breath recorded by staff on radios. The lion was not attacking, but the absence of aggression did not guarantee safety. It presented data that challenged assumptions. Walter Harris remained still, positioned at the edge of the pathway. His immobility was not part of a protocol. It was not authorized action. Yet in practice, his presence influenced the behavior of the animal. Security personnel tightened their hold on rifles but withheld fire. The veterinary director continued her narration through binoculars, reporting with clinical precision the angle of the jaw, the dilation of pupils, the rhythm of the tail. All of it became part of a growing record, a set of field notes compiled under crisis conditions. Apollo paused within meters of the man. His nostrils flared, breathing deepened, as though registering a scent. The lion tilted his head in a small motion, often associated with curiosity in younger animals. Observers described it as mimicry of cub behavior. The act defied expectations of adult predator response. For the institution, this was not evidence of memory or bond. It was evidence of an unpredictable variable, the kind of deviation that exposed the limits of behavioral models. Then came the contact. Apollo leaned forward, mane brushing the space near Walter's hand. The man did not move. His stillness allowed the lion to close the distance. For a brief span of seconds, the animal lowered his head enough for human fingers to rest lightly on coarse fur. The silence across the grounds was nearly total. Cameras recorded. Radios fell quiet. And in that silence, the institution confronted its most profound vulnerability. A system designed on technology and training had yielded the outcome to an undocumented interaction between one man and one lion. The contact did not last. Seconds later, the animal drew back, posture steady, gaze directed forward. But the record remained. Security staff had witnessed a behavior inconsistent with expectations. The veterinary team had noted physical signals contradicting standard interpretations. The moment did not validate legends of loyalty or tales of family. It validated the need for further study and raised urgent questions. How could a large predator retain responses linked to an individual long after separation? More importantly, what did such a possibility mean for risk management? For those present, the outcome was relief. For the institution, it was a reminder that safety had been secured not by the planned sequence of actions, but by an anomaly. The incident could not be framed as a protocol executed correctly. It was instead an irregularity, one that required reclassification and research. Apollo's contact with Walter Harris was not a miracle. It was data, unanticipated and unaccounted for, a field note written into the margins of a crisis that exposed the inadequacy of official systems. After the brief contact between lion and man, silence did not transform into safety. What followed was not resolution but procedure carried out under tension. Apollo remained on the path, his posture steady but unpredictable, his presence still representing risk to everyone within range. Walter Harris adjusted his stance, turning gradually toward the direction of the enclosure. He made no gestures, spoke no words, but his movement created a vector that others began to interpret as a potential route of control. Security officers quickly recalibrated. They formed a moving perimeter, weapons still trained on the animal, radios carrying clipped updates. Each step was measured, each position checked and reinforced. The group advanced not as part of a coordinated drill, but as an improvised procession shaped around the behavior of the lion. The institution that prided itself on written protocols was now dependent on adaptive response, guided less by planning than by circumstance. Visitors who had not evacuated pressed forward again, some recording with phones, others standing in hushed attention. To the public it looked ceremonial, almost symbolic, an elderly man leading a predator back to confinement. To the staff it was a precarious operation, where a single misstep could trigger chaos. The system had already failed once by allowing escape. Now it functioned only because an exception had presented itself. As the group approached the reinforced enclosure, tension peaked. The gate stood open, checked repeatedly by personnel stationed nearby. Every lock was tested, every latch monitored. Apollo paused at the threshold, gaze shifting between the bars and the figure of Walter. The hesitation stretched seconds into minutes. Weapons remained fixed, commands were debated over radios, and contingency plans hung suspended. The success of the operation depended not on established systems, but on the lion's choice to comply. Eventually, Apollo stepped forward, crossing into the enclosure with deliberate motion. Staff acted immediately, securing gates, confirming seals, and reactivating electronic locks. The sound of metal closing echoed across the grounds. For those holding weapons, it was the signal to lower arms. For administrators, it was the fragile relief of risk narrowly avoided. The animal was contained, but the institution knew containment had been restored not by protocol, but by anomaly. Walter stood near the bars briefly before withdrawing. His presence had facilitated resolution, but it had also exposed dependency. A retired keeper with no official authority had become central to the zoo's crisis management. The narrative for the public emphasized relief and closure. The narrative inside the institution was different. A critical operation had succeeded not because the system functioned, but because chance provided a figure capable of stabilizing the moment. The return of Apollo to his enclosure did not demonstrate the strength of security systems. It demonstrated their weakness. The incident underscored how reliance on luck and individual improvisation can replace coordinated readiness. The zoo had completed the operation, but the method of success carried the weight of indictment. What should have been proof of resilience had become evidence of vulnerability. By the evening of the incident, the zoo declared the crisis resolved. Apollo was secured, visitors had exited the grounds, and staff could finally exhale. Yet relief did not erase the central fact. The institution had failed in its primary responsibility. A lion had left containment, and order had been restored not by the strength of the system, but by the convergence of chance. The following day, an official review began, structured as a multi-department audit. Engineers, security officers, veterinary staff, and outside consultants were brought together, not to celebrate survival, but to document error. The findings quickly revealed a rare but consequential flaw in the electronic locking system. According to the technical report, the likelihood of such a malfunction was classified as minimal, yet probability offered no comfort once the outcome had materialized. A single point of failure had been enough to compromise the integrity of an entire facility. The design had promised redundancy, but in practice delivered vulnerability. The report emphasized that no system can be assumed flawless, a lesson too often learned only in retrospect. Beyond the hardware failure, the audit identified procedural gaps. Communication during the crisis was fragmented, with overlapping radio commands creating confusion rather than clarity. Decision-making authority remained unclear in critical moments. The head of security hesitated without definitive instruction. Veterinary input, though precise, did not translate into operational orders. Staff followed instincts rather than coordinated protocols. In the language of the review, the incident exposed a lack of integrated response capacity under non-standard conditions. Administrative records showed another pattern. While resources had been allocated to infrastructure and public exhibits, fewer investments were directed toward emergency drills and fail-safe mechanisms. The institution had relied on reputation and past performance as indicators of safety rather than continuous testing of systems under stress. Public trust had been built on appearances of control, but control had not been systematically verified. The review committee concluded with a set of mandatory reforms. Locking mechanisms were to be replaced on an accelerated schedule. Inspection intervals were shortened, and manual overrides were redesigned for redundancy. Communication chains were rewritten to eliminate ambiguity of command. A new requirement mandated quarterly crisis simulations, not for public display but for staff accountability. These measures were described not as innovations but as overdue corrections. Underlying the technical recommendations was a broader recognition. The zoo had allowed its narrative of professionalism to obscure structural weaknesses. The presence of Walter Harris in the crisis, though celebrated by observers, was not framed as a triumph in the report. It was listed as a liability, an unplanned element that had altered the outcome. Reliance on individuals outside the official chain of command was categorized as unacceptable risk. The fact that a retired keeper had played a decisive role highlighted the institution's dependence on exceptions rather than resilience. The review did not attempt to soften its conclusions. A system designed to guarantee safety had failed, and recovery had come through chance rather than design. The policy changes introduced in the aftermath were not signs of strength but admissions of prior neglect. The incident revealed that public institutions cannot depend on reputation, technology, or isolated dedication. They require constant scrutiny, revision, and acceptance of responsibility. Without those, the promise of safety remains fragile, as it had on the morning when a lion walked free. The incident at Riverside City Zoo did not conclude with the closing of a gate. In many ways, it began there. Administrators, academics, and regulators recognized that the escape and recapture of Apollo carried implications extending beyond the boundaries of a single facility. What had appeared as a contained crisis was reframed as a case study in institutional accountability. Great Lakes University, in partnership with the zoo, launched a formal research program focused on emotional memory and behavioral response in large predators. Data collected during the incident, including video footage, security transcripts, veterinary notes, and eyewitness reports, formed the basis of the study. Researchers examined whether long-term memory of early human care could explain Apollo's behavior. The objective was not to romanticize the event, but to analyze it as an anomaly that challenged established models of animal behavior. Preliminary findings suggested that recognition across decades was possible, yet the academic framing emphasized probability rather than certainty. The educational dimension developed alongside research. Public programs were redesigned to move away from simplified narratives of bravery or miracle. Instead, schools were invited to use the incident as a lesson in responsibility. Guides explained to students how a single system failure placed hundreds at risk, and how risk management requires redundancy, discipline, and humility. Visitors were taught to read behavioral signals not as evidence of affection, but as indicators that demand structured interpretation. The message delivered to families was clear. Respect for animals means acknowledging unpredictability and protecting life through order, not spectacle. The zoo also established community forums, presenting the results of audits and ongoing reforms. These sessions did not sanitize the event. They detailed the locking failure, the communication breakdown, and the reliance on an unplanned participant in the crisis. By making this information public, the institution attempted to restore trust not by hiding weakness, but by admitting it. Transparency became part of accountability, a recognition that public institutions operate within a social contract that demands honesty. The larger implication extended beyond one zoo. Regulatory bodies began reviewing standards across facilities. Industry conferences dedicated sessions to the Apollo case, focusing on the intersection of animal behavior, safety systems, and human factors. The incident was no longer just a story. It was evidence presented to a professional community, material used to push policy toward greater rigor. Walter Harris continued to appear in the research process, not as a celebrated hero, but as a variable in a controlled observation. Monthly supervised visits were included in study protocols, with every behavioral response from Apollo logged and compared. For scientists, these sessions were not reunions but data collection. For the institution, they were reminders that responsibility does not end with containment. It extends into how lessons are learned, how risks are documented, and how accountability is shared with the public. Over time, the narrative shifted. Apollo was not remembered as a symbol of miracle, nor Walter as a figure of myth. Instead, both were placed within a framework of science and governance. The lion became a case in behavioral memory. The man became an entry in the record of institutional dependency. The incident itself transformed into a touchstone for education and reform, illustrating how public trust is built not on isolated outcomes, but on systems tested, corrected, and continually reinforced. Sunlight returned to the zoo as the last echoes of Sirens faded, but the aftermath carried weight heavier than relief. Apollo lay within reinforced walls, his breathing calm, his presence once again confined. On the other side of the bars, Walter Harris stood with his cane, a retired keeper whose role in the event would not be celebrated within official reports. The zoo knew that survival of the day had been secured not by protocol but by chance. What unfolded on that October morning did not prove the strength of institutional design. It exposed its weaknesses. Technology that promised reliability failed. Communication that promised clarity fractured. An animal that should have remained secure walked freely through public space. Containment was restored, but only because an unplanned human factor intervened. The event became a lesson not in bravery or miracle, but in the fragility of systems trusted too easily. For the institution, the path forward was not to frame the moment as legend. It was to revise schedules, repair structures, retrain staff, and accept that public trust depends on honesty as much as on steel. For the wider community, the lesson extended further. Safety in shared spaces is not guaranteed by appearances of order, but by constant scrutiny of the systems that claim to provide it. Complacency is the enemy of security, and only through accountability can risk be managed. Walter's presence at the enclosure in later months was acknowledged, but not as myth. His role became part of research, logged as data, referenced as anomaly. The narrative stripped of sentiment revealed the truth. Institutions cannot rely on exceptions to protect lives. They must build resilience into the ordinary. The story of Apollo and Walter Harris did not end as a tale of personal courage or timeless bond. It ended as evidence that discipline, transparency, and institutional rigor define real strength. The crisis left behind no miracle, only an obligation to ensure that safety never again rests on chance. If this story resonates with you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and turn on notifications so you will not miss future episodes. Explore the playlist for more accounts of how people and animals shape our understanding of responsibility. And a question to you: in protecting public spaces, what matters most? Discipline, safety, or memory? Share your thoughts in the comments.
Don't you fall for the destination? Don't you pass for that hard moment, love? Don't you fall for the destination? Let them know where to take this road.